I once got a paper, I've got a couple of papers from students who said, well, if determinism isn't true because we don't know everything that's going on. Or how do you determine this? And I'm like, I don't. Determinism doesn't say I can determine stuff. It doesn't say I can figure stuff out. It doesn't say I can predict anything. It doesn't say I know anything. Determinism is just what's going on. Determinism is the explanation for why the world makes sense to us, why we can do science, why we can figure out how mechanisms in cells move proteins from one site to another, or how particles get mass. We can figure this stuff out because there's something actually going on. There's a way the universe works. Right? We never know more than a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of what's actually going on. Right? So, and what's going on depends on the actions of billions of particles. Right? So we can predict some things, and where we can predict those things, we know that that system is at least partially, that agglomeration of bits is at least partially deterministic. Now, it brings me to something that I remember Palmer said. I want to talk about sloppy reasoning about determinism, sloppy reasoning about causality. Palmer's statistical causality. Smoking raises the probability of cancer. Right, he says this in the text, that smoking raises the probability of the cancer, but it doesn't determine who will get cancer. Which smoker will die of cancer. All right? So you have a group of heavy smokers after 10 years heavy smoking. Let's say 10% of them have lung cancer. Right? Say 100 smokers after 10 years, 10 of them have lung cancer. And Palmer seems to think this is evidence of a new kind of causality, where some stuff is caused, 10 people in this group will get cancer. And some stuff is uncaused, that it's just random. It's this guy, it's this guy, it's this guy, completely random, not caused. Not caused that it's Fred that gets cancer and Jeff that doesn't. This is deeply misleading. This is wrong. Current theories of disease causality accept the laws of physics for macroscopic things like atoms and things made of atoms. Right? There is no such thing as statistical causality for things like smoking. What's happening is that we do not know everything that goes on inside a human being. One human being who smokes heavily for 20 years gets cancer. Another human being who who smokes 20 years heavily for 20 years doesn't get cancer. We don't know why, but that doesn't mean it's random. An unknown cause is not the same as a random cause. Current physics tells us that if you have, and it's not physically possible to arrange this, but if you take the same group of people and wound the universe back, so that all of human society and the entire, you had to move the planet back in its course, right? Move the planet back 10 years, unwind time, So that the universe, or at least the part of the universe that could possibly affect these people, is exactly the same as it was 10 years ago, and then let time run forward, the same people would get cancer this time as did last time, and the same people would escape cancer. Because what we have here is causes that we don't see. Right? There's causes that we don't understand. If you talk to doctors, you talk to medical researchers, people who study medicine, who study disease, there are certain things of, we don't know why this guy gets diabetes and this guy doesn't. This guy gets cancer and this guy doesn't. Because everything we know about is the same. But the stuff that we don't know about is not necessarily the same. We now know, thanks to we now know a little bit more about what causes diabetes. And because apparently vesicle transport system, which I only know a little tiny bit about, is something that goes wrong in diabetes. And there's a particular way that it goes wrong. Well, some people have a predisposition to diabetes. We don't know that ahead of time. We find out when they're the ones who get diabetes.
You're talking about like predisposition due to genetics?
Yeah, due to genetics. There's causal factors. By the way, one of the things that makes a difference between who gets cancer and who doesn't get cancer is the strength of the immune system. So if you look at 1,000 people of whom are all heavy smokers, and some got cancer, let's say 5% got cancer, so 50 out of 1,000 people got lung cancer. And you look at those people and you start looking to those lifestyles, you will start finding differences between the ones who got cancer and the ones who didn't. A strong immune system protects against cancer. Well, someone who abuses himself, who doesn't take care of himself, well, that might turn out to be one of the guys who gets cancer. There's stuff we don't know. So when Palmer says, we have a statistical model of causality where some parts are determined and other parts are not determined, he does not have evidence for that, particularly not in the case of smoking and cancer. We don't understand the entire system of how people get cancer. That doesn't mean it's random. So that's one of the things I want to get across, is you've got to have the correct understanding of how causality works and how statistical stuff works. When we talk about statistics, right, when we're collecting statistics, we're only taking a tiny sample of information. Right? So when we're talking about probabilities and things, when we talk about probabilities, it's because we don't know everything that's going on. Right? If we knew everything that was going on, we could be certain.
There was a statement you made about unknown.
Yeah.
Unknown
causality. There are things involved that we don't know about. The more we know about systems, the more predictable they become. When you know a lot about a system, it's more predictable than when you don't know anything. Right. We have the ability to largely predict people who will get diabetes and who won't. There may be genetic tests, I'm not sure, but people who are sedentary and who eat a lot of sugar or highly processed white bread, highly processed flour products, more likely to get diabetes than people who eat paleo diet, with very little sugar and lots of protein and vegetables and fiber. People who eat fiber, much less likely to get stomach cancer or stomach polyps. High fiber diet is actually very good for you.
I think the phrasing I was looking for that you mentioned was unknown causality is not randomness, I think. Is that what you said?
Yeah, causality is not randomness. The one locus where people think there might be indeterminism is quantum mechanics, and I'm actually going to get into that. Quantum mechanics, some interpretations of quantum mechanics say that if you have two atoms of uranium, that are identical, they're exactly the same, right? They could decay at different times. So we've got uranium is an atom that radioactively decays, that is, it emits certain kinds of particles and changes into another element. Who knows? Does anyone know what uranium generally? I think uranium-238 generally decays to radon, which is a gas. That's where radon comes through. Uranium is down there in the earth, turning into radon, and it just percolates up through the soil. So, right, you've got two atoms of uranium, and the idea is, according to some interpretations of quantum mechanics, which I don't necessarily accept, maybe not, but according to some definitions of quantum mechanics, if you have two identical uranium atoms, and I mean that they're identical down to the quarks, down to the positions of the quarks, to infinitely many decimal places and the variations, possible variations. Whatever's going on in this uranium atom, exactly the same thing is going on inside this uranium atom. Uranium atoms are very complicated. They have lots of neutrons, lots of protons, lots of electrons. I think like 238 protons or 235 protons, and the same number of electrons. And I have no idea how many neutrons, but it's a lot. Right? So you have these two. Now, determinism says same condition, same result. Indeterminism, same condition, different result. And so quantum mechanics says, or some interpretations of quantum mechanics, the Heisenberg interpretation of quantum mechanics, says that this could decay when this one doesn't, even though they're identical. Now, I don't necessarily believe this. I think there might be stuff going on in hydrogen atoms that periodically causes them to decay. The parts are moving around, and sometimes they could be like they're moving around in orbits and things, and they go a little almost to decay, and suddenly one does. And that if you set it up exactly the same way, the same thing would happen. There are deterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics, but the indeterministic one is cool. It's cool. It's the one Heisenberg does. I'm not sure if I buy it. So, in the Heisenberg interpretation of quantum mechanics, things sometimes happen without being caused. Right. So things can happen at random, things can happen that are not determined. Indeterminism is thought to be, by some people, to be a feature of quantum mechanics. Now, I'm going to talk about a bit of what I think is sloppy writing in our textbook. Right. You have Palmer on page 222. Palmer defines says that the person in the street believes that her actions are at least sometimes up to her. That it's up to her what she does. We believe that our actions are at least sometimes up to us, meaning that I could have a cup of coffee, I could pick up my coffee and have a little drink, and or I could have not done that. Right? Why did I do that? Because I wanted to. It was up to me whether I did or not, and I decided, and then I did it. Right? Now that's not weird, right? That's not weird. That's kind of like, I think that's what we all already believe. If that little survey I did at the beginning of class is right? I think that's what we believe. Palmer calls this view indeterminism. I looked at it 3 times in the book there on page 222. He says this view is called will be called indeterminism. What we do is up to us is called indeterminism. I think that's a bad name for it. I would prefer to call it free willism. So I'm going to put this up in green. I call this free willism. Sorry, all one word. Free willism. And I leave aside the question of whether determinism or indeterminism is operating here. So that's how he defines indeterminism on page 222. Our actions up to us. How does he define indeterminism on page 237? The one where he talks about Heisenberg and has a picture of a guy throwing himself through a window. Right? This is indeterminism. Heisenberg is using it. Now, there's a very peculiar thing about Heisenberg. Heisenberg came up with the idea that there was no hidden causality for quantum decay, all on his own, and he didn't really give an argument for it. He kind of, I've read Heisenberg's biography, he kind of just added it on there. I don't know of a good solid argument that there's no hidden variables. There's something called Bell's theorem, which is supposed to be such an argument, but the physicists I've talked to, every so often I meet a physicist, and every time I do, if I get a chance, I ask them this question, and the physicists I've said say, well, some people like to interpret quantum mechanics as indeterministically. Some people like to interpret it deterministically. It works either way, and most physicists don't really care. Now, indeterminism, first of all, indeterminism doesn't seem to percolate up into larger structures. Right? But what would happen if our brains were indeterministic? Well, Palmer recognizes this. He says, well, you know, if our brains were not deterministic, or if Heisenberg is right, and this quantum randomness, this quantum indeterminism, had an effect on our actions, every so often we'd do something crazy. We'd jump through a window, we'd kick things, we'd spasm. Or a bit of our brain would break down, right? Indeterminism would stop our atoms sticking together. So if you have this kind of indeterminate, well, I guess you could say just an indeterminism making neurons fire without a cause. Right? A neuron fires and there's no reason for it to fire. It's not primed to fire, just the firing happens and the neuron goes, well, hey, what the hell, why did I do that? Right. So what happens if there's indeterminism in the brain? We do random stuff. We do stuff that we didn't choose to do, and we look at it and we go, why did I do that? I didn't want to do that. And so on page 237 he defines indeterminism as basically our actions not up to us. Right? Because the guy throwing himself in for the window didn't choose to do it. It doesn't represent his choices. And so we have two definitions of indeterminism. One says we determine our own actions. That's what this says, by the way. Sometimes we determine our own actions. And then indeterminism is our action. We don't determine our actions. It's the opposite meaning. On two different pages, he defines indeterminism as the opposite of what it is. So I am particularly annoyed by this move by Palmer, where he takes this perfectly sensible thing and says we should call this this thing which says that our actions are not random with respect to our desires, and says this is indeterminism. People believe in indeterminism. No, they believe in free will. We believe we have control over our actions. Okay. So we have control, we believe that we have control over our actions. We don't believe that our actions are indeterministic. Now, how does Palmer weasel out of the 237, page 237, definition of indeterminism?
He says that indeterminism is the view that determinism is false.
Right, but on 237, what does he say? Immediately after the Heisenberg bit. Heisenberg fails to say free will. Right? Heisenberg says, look, if determinism isn't true, then we would have free will because we would do random stuff like banging our heads into the wall when we really wanted to eat a piece of chocolate. Oh wait, no. Right? Free will is obviously not randomness. Right? Palmer says one sentence and he draws a little diagram. He says, but there are not two things here, but three. Do you see the little triangle diagram there? All right. All right. And it's got three poles. And it's got, now, weirdly, he uses a different nomenclature here. And I'm going to write Palmer's names in black. Right. He says that it can be necessity, which he takes to be a synonym for determinism. Because other kinds of necessity, like fate, predetermination, programming, are not determinism, so they're outside the scope of this discussion. I'm not defending the idea that free will is compatible with predestination. I'm not defending the idea that free will is compatible with predetermination or an idea of fate or an idea of God controlling what you do or anything else like that. I'm just defending the idea that free will is compatible with determinism. And Palmer has several times used the word necessity as a synonym for determinism. He also uses the word randomness. Which is a synonym for indeterminism. Is there anywhere in the book where he makes a distinction between randomness and indeterminism? It says randomness and indeterminism are different because of this. No, he doesn't. And if he did, we would stop talking about randomness, because if randomness and indeterminism are different, we shouldn't use the word randomness, because we're not really talking about whatever that is. And what does he call the other one? He calls it freedom. So there's a possible for a state of a bunch of stuff, you take a bunch of stuff together, and it's possible for it to be, it could be in a state of necessity, it could operate under necessity, it could operate under randomness, that what happens next is not determined by what happens, or it can operate in a state of freedom, which is free, which is what? What is a free state? What do we call freedom? Well, we're talking about free will, we're talking about lack of coercion. But how is lack of coercion related to determinism or indeterminism? Well, let's look at this diagram again. I'm going to write in a consistent nomenclature. All right, the system's here, it's deterministic. Right, and he says it's not 2 but 3, so this one is different from both of those. This one, it's not this and it's not that. It's not necessity and it's not randomness. So it's not deterministic. And, because it's not that one either, not deterministic. Okay. So in the little triangle diagram, which has no explanation and no argument and no illustrative example or anything beyond just a statement, he has 3 poles. One's deterministic, one's not deterministic, and the other's not deterministic and not deterministic. It's not this and it's not that. So it's not deterministic and it's not deterministic. Do you begin to see the problem? Right. There's a law in logic called the law of non-contradiction. You're not supposed, things that are self-contradictions cannot be true. Can't be a married bachelor, can't be a square circle, can't be something and not that thing, can't be not something and not that thing. This is a self-contradiction. It's a whopping great self-contradiction. I left off a D. So if I tell you, okay, my girlfriend's not pregnant, and she's not pregnant, could that be possible? Right, if someone's not dead, and they're not dead, could that be possible? Absent zombies. Right, zombies don't count because they're not real. Right. It can't work. And this is one of the stupidest things I've ever seen in a philosophy book. And it looks, it looks plausible when he calls it necessity, randomness, freedom. But he doesn't define freedom in a way that relates it to necessity or randomness. He just says freedom. And what freedom is really, freedom is not a lack of determinism. Freedom is not a lack of indeterminism. Freedom is a lack of coercion. When we do something of our own free will, we do it not being coerced. It's something we do without coercion. Something we do, what we choose to do. All right, so, and I want to check something over here. Okay, so let me actually define free will, and you will find that I can define free will without talking about determinism or indeterminism. And I'm going to do it, I'll do it here. All right, so let me give you a paradigm case. Now, first, free will is two words. Free and will. Now, the language, English language, can trip us up here. Right. And I sometimes have people say that coerced actions are free-willed actions because the person could have chosen not to hand over the money and be shot. And that's really not what it's talking about. So here's the traditional paradigm definition of free will. Guy goes into a bank, pulls a gun, points the gun at a teller in a very convincing manner and says, hand over all the cash in the drawer. The teller has no escape, doesn't have a gun under the desk and can't duck down and be safe. It's a badly designed bank. And does as she's told. Well, someone mugs you, right? They hold a gun to your head and say, hand over your cash, and you give up your cash. So, right, the teller hands over the money. Now, in law, and this is very important in the case of moral judgment and legal judgment, we think it makes a difference whether something was done of the person's free will or not. So, the bank robber is guilty because he chose to go in to the bank with a gun and threaten someone. Now, the teller is not his accomplice. The teller handed him the money. He wouldn't have the money if the teller hadn't opened her drawer and handed it over. And she did it, but she didn't do it willingly. She chose to do it because she rightly feared for her life if she didn't. And that's a paradigm example of coercion. Coercion is when someone tells you to do something. They don't grab your hands and make you do it. They tell you to do something under a threat. If you don't do this, I'll kill your kitten. I'll insult your parents. I'll reveal to everyone that you collect decorative plates. You have some terrible blackmail as a form of coercion. Extortion is a form of coercion. Right. You pay, but you do not pay willingly. You do not do it of your own free will. However, if a bank teller goes into the bank, takes money out of the drawer, puts it in her pocket, walks out the bank, goes and spends it, runs away to Vegas, that's of her own free will because no one had a gun to her head. There was no coercion. Coerced actions are not free will. Uncoerced actions are free will. That's a standard paradigm definition. That's the definition used by what's called soft determinism, which is the view that free will exists and determinism is true. That or volitional determinism is true, that our brains work deterministically to decide what actions we'll do, to determine what actions we'll do. you act under duress, it's not free will. If you determine what you do, it is free will. And notice the word determine. Does that seem unnatural there in this definition? The idea of you determining what you do, or the idea of your preferences determining what you want to do, or your preferences and needs determining what your decisions are? It doesn't seem unnatural. Right? Here's a sort of radical view that Palmer doesn't seem to recognize. Free will can only exist under determinism. If you remove the determinism from a person, their free will evaporate. It'll go. Because free will is when you determine what you do. Okay. So, any questions so far? Is this all clear? Because I'm basically telling you the opposite of what the textbook told you. And I think the opposite makes sense, but I could be wrong.
I don't know why he decided to go into say something about libertarianism. I don't think.
Well, he's a libertarian. He believes that determinism, destroys free will. Determinism excludes free will. Determinism makes free will not be there. He believes that. And I think he goes through certain mental contortions to avoid facing the implications of what he's saying. That's my personal belief. I could be completely wrong about that. This is pure speculation. I can't see inside someone's head. I'm just trying to speculate about why he would talk about libertarianism. I think he believes that. He describes the idea of could do otherwise as a remarkable thing. There's a lot of indications in there that okay. So that made no sense. All right. So I want to talk about one of the things that I want to talk about something that Palmer says that I think really obfuscates the relationship between determinism and free will, and really obfuscates the way people work. There's this picture, right, in the book of a guy pushing a block from behind and then another guy pulling a block behind him, right? Teleological, pull from ahead, causal, push from behind. That can't be literally true. First, he can't mean that. He can't mean that teleology is pulled from ahead, because we're talking about events that unfold through time. And if teleology meant we're pulled from ahead from the future, that means that stuff that hasn't happened yet causes stuff to happen now. There's two things wrong with it. One, it's a causal model, and he's trying to avoid a causal model. Two, he's the future can't influence the past. We can't change the past. Time runs one way. Everything we know about the universe says time runs one way. Causality runs way. We can cause changes in the future. We can cause things to happen in the future. We cannot reach back and change what happened in the past. There's actually an interesting little branch of philosophy of speculating about that and thinking about it and trying to come up with scenarios and talking about people thinking that kind of thing. But generally speaking, the future doesn't influence us. So what does influence us? Well, our ideas about the future. Right. So, teleological model. We act to achieve goals in the future. Right. I'm an adjunct faculty. I work semester to semester, and I try to do a good job for the courses, the schools I work for, so that they will hire me to teach other classes in the future. Right? A goal is an attempt to influence the future. A future where I have money and fun is better than a future where I don't have money and don't have fun. I'm lucky in my chosen occupation. I don't make much money, but I do get paid to do stuff I really like to do. I don't have a job. I have a paid hobby. Right. So we act to achieve goals in the future. Sometimes we don't understand the goals, so we don't realize what we're acting for. But basically, they tell you this, right, in self-help groups, books, in success seminars or whatever. You know, people are trying to help you out. They say, look, set goals for yourself. Right? And that's the teleological model. We act to achieve goals. Right? And that's the pull from the future. But it's not a real pull. It's a pull in the imagination. We imagine what the future could be like and act to try to achieve it. Right. So, we try. Right. Causal model. Act. Let's just say we act. Because of events and conditions in the past and present. The present instant, the now. So, right, we act because of events and conditions in the past and present. Are these incompatible? Are these opposites? No. What is one of the things we do as a result of experiences in the past? Say you've had a bad experience in the past because you were just drifting, right? Your life is not under your control. What do? You might set a goal. If you wake up one day and you realize, well, you know what, I don't have very much money and I don't enjoy what I do for a living. I'll go to college, get a degree in something that I can make money at. Philosophy is not a good bet, by the way. I'm very, very lucky to make any money at all doing this. see, I've got the bug. Right. We act because of events of movement. That's why we form goals. One of the things we do form goals. Why do I have the goals I have? I have a certain number of goals. I wanted to get a full-time teaching condition. I want to make enough money so that I can afford a horse of my own so I can go riding with my girlfriend. I want to write a book because, well, I want to have that book and say, hey, look, I wrote a book. Read it. No, please, read it, please. Oh, come on, read it. Right. I want to write a book. Actually, I want to write a series of philosophical stories. You know that Hell Mountain story I had you guys read? I've got like 8 ideas for different philosophical stories. For some reason, this semester, any philosophical trope that comes along, I've been able to think of a story to illustrate it. Right? And right. So I'm going to write these the philosophical adventures of Lucifer de Montaigne. And I want to write that because I think that'd be cool and would help teaching. If I can have a set of stories for the students to read to prepare for some of the classes. And I want to own a 9mm of some kind, preferably a Czech or Polish weapon. Have you ever heard of a Radom pistol? It's World War II. It's one of the best automatics ever. Very, very simple. Or a Browning high power, that'll do. And I want to have a continuous supply of very, very, very good scotch.
Macallan?
No. Lagavulin or Caol Ila. And Lafroig 15 or quarter cask. Oh yeah, I've done my research. I know, yeah. Actually, it would be a different bottle every time because I like a lot of different kinds of. So, and I formed these goals. Well, why do I want to have the goal of getting a bottle of good scotch? Because I've tried scotch in the past, and there's certain kinds of scotch, like Caol Ila or Freud 15-year-old, and a number of others. They're just amazing. So I want future deliciousness. And, I wanted my PhD in philosophy so I could teach philosophy and make money. And I achieved half of that. Right? So we have goals because of the past. In fact, we have goals because of who we are, who we were made. If your genetics made you short, is it reasonable for you to choose a goal of being a basketball champion or whatever it is?
Absolutely.
Starting forward for the LA Lakers. Right. Right. If you have my level of athleticism, would you want to be like a pro wrestler or a boxer? I mean, yeah, no, it's not going to work. And in fact, nothing physical is going to work. And also, there's things you like and things you don't like, which are caused by your past. So your teleology is caused. Teleology is not random. It's not undetermined. It's caused by your past. Teleology. It's a lovely fancy word. Goal-directed. Teleology means goal-directed. Teleological means goal-directed. So your teleology, your set of goals, is caused by your history. The teleological model is a causal model. And a properly understood causal model of human motivation and choice is going to be teleological, because that's what we do. And if you look at it this way, trying to make sense of somebody's actions, once you know what someone's goals are, what they do makes much more sense. Right? And when you see what people are doing, it's often, it often doesn't make sense until you take a guess, until you figure out what the goal is. And I've had this happen a number of times where I'd be in some social situation or some business situation and somebody is doing something and I think it's bizarre, and then I realize, oh, they're trying to achieve this. They're trying to do this thing. They've got this goal. You can sort of, sometimes you can look inside people's heads and ask and figure out what they're doing, why they're doing what they're doing, what they want. And it actually makes it a lot easier to deal with people. If you figure out what people want, you will know whether you can get what you want out of them. I have friends or old acquaintances. Those people I don't hang out with anymore because I realize that their goal in any reaction, in any interaction, is to make them sort of feel that like they're better than the people around them. Like they know more or they understand more, and they'll play these little games. You know, they want to be the one who's right, or they want to have this, that they really enjoy righteous indignation. And there are people I just won't talk to anymore because inevitably the conversation will go round to, and then they'll start berating me, trying to find something wrong with the way I do things, because they want to feel better about themselves by abusing someone else. So when you figure out what people's goals are, you know, sometimes it makes them easy to deal with. You can give them what they want, and then they'll give you what you want, or like. And sometimes it's just like, all right, no, goodbye. So, and then you look at them and you look at their histories, and sometimes if you know about the person, enough about the person's history, you can figure out why they have that goal, why they live the way they do, why they want what they want. And it's all in the past, none of it's in the future, okay? The only way the future figures in this is the kinds of futures we imagine for ourselves, the kind of futures they imagine for us, what they want the future to be like. And most people don't think about the future because most people, well, many people do stupid stuff that's keeping them in a bad situation because it feels good at the time. Right? And you have to get them and go, hey, don't do that, look at the future. Right? And we can make a distinction between reactive people who are just reacting to what's going on and forward-looking people who look to the future. And I've been in both situations myself. I've been in situations where I just reacted to what was going on and I didn't take charge of my life, and it's like horrible. Right? And when I realized that I wanted to take, I actually had to realize this several times because I get slipping in. I had made some very poor choices in my life. But when you start to get a grip and you start forming goals and working towards the goals, you get more control over your life. But they're both causal, right? It's both reacting to causes. And when I decide that I'm going to get control over my life and I'm going to stop doing stupid stuff, well, that's because I've suffered the negative consequences of that stupid stuff. So the teleological causal distinction does not help Palmer's case against determinism and free will. Now I'm going to talk about two arguments here, and this is my, I'm going to call it my Palmer-Skinner argument. I'm going to talk about two arguments. Palmer, Skinner. Now, Donald Palmer and B.F. Skinner have a couple of things in common. They're both incompatibilists. Both believe that determinism is not compatible with free will. Right. Both of them believe that determinism is not compatible with free will. Right. And they make sort of similar arguments. moral responsibility requires free will. Move my camera. This is just recording my voice and not seeing my face. Moral responsibility, this is the argument, moral responsibility requires free will. And over here, B.F. Skinner, moral responsibility requires free will. And then there's what I call the red premise. Free will is incompatible . That says incompatible with determinism. And Skinner has the exact same premise. Free will is incompatible with determinism. And free will is compatible with determinism, free will is incompatible with determinism. But where they go from here is different. Palmer, or the libertarians, have as a premise 3, moral responsibility exists. Therefore, conclusion, determinism and the argument is, right, moral responsibility could not exist if free will did not exist, but free will is incompatible with determinism, so the fact that moral responsibility exists means free will exists and determinism is false. Now, the same two premises up there Skinner says, well, determinism is true, and therefore moral responsibility does not exist. B.F. Skinner has this book, wrote this book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Right? It's the book that says, hey, look, all this idea that we are free, purposeful, have dignity, there's this human dignity thing, morality, moral responsibility, that's all rubbish, because determinism is true. And so we don't have free will, so there's no moral responsibility. And Palmer has this thing, no, determinism is false because moral responsibility exists. And I remember a conversation with an otherwise perfectly intelligent fellow graduate student when I'm explaining, oh no, determinism and free will are compatible. You know, determinism is not incompatible with free will. In fact, you need determinism in order to have free will. And he says, well, what about moral responsibility? And I say, well, what about it? I mean, moral responsibility exists because free will exists, can exist because free will exists, and free will exists because it's not incompatible with the determinism. And he says, well, what about people who say that determinism rules out free will and rules out moral responsibility? I said, well, they're wrong. Right? It's not an argument to say, well, we have moral responsibility, so determinism has to be false. And I'm saying, well, no, we don't. I mean, we don't, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It doesn't have to be false. So we have two people here who have the same idea that free will is incompatible with determinism, this red premise. And they flip it over. One says, well, determinism is true, so there's no moral responsibility. And the other one says moral responsibility exists, so determinism is false. Now, I want to ask you, what's the further difference between these two? What does one have that the other doesn't? And I'll give it to you in one word. Evidence. Right. Skinner's third premise is not determinism is true. Skinner's third evidence is there is tons, I mean tons, absolutely many, many, thousands of, there's an incredible amount of evidence for determinism. There is tons of evidence for determinism. Virtually every scientific experiment ever done, the fact that our technology works, every piece of working technology out there is evidence that determinism is true. If determinism wasn't true, this stuff wouldn't work. We would not be able to understand the laws of nature well enough to build machines to exploit the laws of nature. When you talk about moral responsibility in the text, does he give any evidence that moral responsibility exists? People believe it exists, and sometimes people get very upset if you suggest to them that it doesn't. But that's not evidence of existence. I mean, there are people who feel that way about ghosts and fairies. Moral responsibility is something we believe in, most of us, that we'd very much like to believe in, that we would be very distressed if it didn't exist, turned out not to exist. I would be personally very distressed if moral responsibility turned out not to exist. I'm a firm believer in moral responsibility. But you ask me to prove that moral responsibility exists, I can't say, well, the Large Hadron Collider, or Foucault's pendulum experiments, or Galileo's rolling balls, or Newton's observation, or Kepler's laws, or I can't say that. I can't say anything like that. You can say that for determinism. There's overwhelming evidence that determinism is true. There is absolutely no evidence, nothing like scientific evidence. It's also for the idea that moral responsibility exists. The argument for the existence of moral responsibility, if there is an argument at all, is much, 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 much weaker than the argument for determinism. So, in this argument, this is the stronger, this dispute, this is the stronger argument. This works much, much better this way. This seems to be wishful thinking. And the key is, right, if we want moral responsibility to exist, then we have to find something wrong with this argument. These two are solid. There's tons of evidence to determine. Determinism is true. And if it's not, there's no free will anyway. Lack of determinism rules out free will. That is insanely clear. Right? This, I think, is unproblematic. Moral responsibility requires free will. I don't see how we could ever assign moral responsibility if free will didn't exist. This is the one that I think is weak. I think that this is wrong. And so next week, I want to talk about whether anyone can prove that free will is incompatible with determinism. If it is, there's no free will. So hopefully the arguments will be back. All right.